He wandered the streets aimlessly drifting through the city, a ghost in his own life. Henry, they called him. Crazy Henry, they whispered, their voices filled with pity and fear. He was lost in the labyrinth of his mind, a maze with no exit. The world outside was a blur, a distorted reality he couldn't grasp, a cacophony of noise and color that meant nothing to him, just a chaotic mess. He saw but didn't register, heard but didn't listen. His senses were dulled. His life was a silent film played out in a world of sound and fury. People avoided his gaze, pretending he didn't exist. They saw the wildness in his eyes, a madness that scared them. The unkempt beard and tattered clothes spoke of a life off the rails, a life that had lost its way. Henry was a stark reminder that the line between sanity and madness is thin, a fragile boundary easily crossed. He was a fallen angel, once full of promise, now broken. Cast out from the grace of normalcy, he was an outcast. His days were spent in a haze of confusion, a fog that never lifted. Nights were an endless cycle of nightmares and cold sweats. He was adrift, lost in his own mind. Tossed about by the waves of his own troubled mind, he struggled to stay afloat. Alone in a crowded room, surrounded by people yet utterly isolated, there was no comfort in the familiar, no solace in the known, no solace in the arms of sleep. He was trapped in a cycle of insomnia and despair, confined within the prison of his own making, a cell with invisible bars. And there seemed to be no escape, no way out of the darkness that enveloped him. Whispers followed him. They slithered through the alleyways, leapt from the shadows. They spoke of a place for people like him, where silence reigned and shadows danced. He tried to ignore them, to block out the insidious whispers that wormed their way into his brain. But the whispers persisted, growing louder, more insistent. One day they took him, men in white coats. Their eyes were cold, clinical, devoid of empathy. He didn't fight, didn't speak. He simply allowed himself to be led away, like a lamb to the slaughter. The van smelled of stale cigarettes and disinfectant. He stared out of the window, watching the world rush by in a blur of green and brown. Where were they taking him? What awaited him at the end of this journey? He didn't have to wait long to find out. The building loomed before him, imposing and grey. It stood like a monolith, casting a long shadow over his spirit, like a tombstone erected against the dying light, a monument to lost hope and forgotten dreams. It seemed to suck the air from his lungs. He shivered, feeling the weight of the structure pressing down on him. Though the day was warm, a cold dread settled in his stomach. He knew that crossing this threshold meant leaving behind everything he once knew. He knew in his heart that this was no sanctuary. It was a place where souls were broken and spirits crushed. This was a place where hope went to die, where dreams were shattered and forgotten. They stripped him of his clothes, his identity, his dignity, his name, everything that made him who he was. He was no longer Henry. He was a number, a faceless entity in a sea of despair, a problem to be solved, or perhaps simply contained. A statistic in a system that cared little for the individual. They dressed him in rough cotton pajamas, 2 sizes too big. He felt small, insignificant, as if he had been reduced to nothing. They led him down a long corridor, each step echoing the finality of his fate, the air thick with the smell of bleach and despair, a sterile scent that masked the underlying rot. The sound of his rubber-soled shoes squeaking against the linoleum floor echoed in the silence, a haunting reminder of his isolation. Each step seemed to take him further and further away from the world he knew, from the life he once lived. The world outside faded away, replaced by the cold, unyielding reality of his new existence, replaced by the stark reality of his new surroundings. He was trapped in a place where time stood still, a prisoner in his own mind, haunted by the memories of what once was, and there was no escape, no way to turn back the clock, only the endless march of days in this concrete tomb. The room was bare, devoid of any comfort or stimulation. The walls were padded, the floor covered in a thin, stained mattress. A single, bare light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows that danced and flickered in the gloom. The air was thick with the smell of disinfectant and something else, something foul and alive. He sat on the edge of the mattress, his back against the wall. He didn't move, didn't speak. He felt his sanity slipping away, like sand through his fingers. He was adrift in a sea of madness, and there was no one to throw him a lifeline. Then he saw them. They scurried across the floor. Small, furry bodies, their eyes glinting in the dim light. Rats! Dozens of them, perhaps hundreds. He shuddered, repulsed, yet strangely drawn to them. He watched them, every night without fail, fascinated and repulsed in equal measure. A strange mix of emotions he couldn't quite understand. They moved with a strange grace, an eerie elegance that seemed almost choreographed, a silent understanding of their domain. They knew every inch of the darkness. Their eyes, black and beady, seemed to follow his every move. They whispered to him. In the darkness they communicated, their voices a low, chittering sound. They were everywhere, in the corners, under the mattress, in the walls, always present. He could hear them scratching, gnawing. The sounds were a constant reminder, their presence a constant reminder of his own isolation, a loneliness that was almost palpable. He felt a strange kinship with these creatures. They were outcasts too, feared and reviled, just like him. He began to leave them scraps of food, a small gesture of connection, crumbs from his meager meals. It was all he could offer. They would gather around him, their tiny noses twitching, eager for the small offerings, their eyes never leaving his. He talked to them. They were his silent confidence, whispering his fears and anxieties into the darkness. They listened. He was certain of it. He was sure of it. In their own way, they understood him. They were his only companions in this sterile hell, a bond formed in the shadows. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. He lost track of time. The outside world faded into a distant memory. He existed solely within the confines of his padded cell, with his rats. Their presence was a comfort, a distraction from the maddening silence. He learned their ways, their hierarchy, their language. He gave them names. He was no longer alone. He had found companionship in the most unlikely of places. They were his family now, his only family. One day he reached out and stroked one of the rats. Its fur was surprisingly soft. It didn't flinch away. It just sat there, staring up at him with its beady eyes. He felt a connection, a bond. He was no longer just Crazy Henry. He was the Rat King. He lost himself in their world. Their scurrying and squeaking became his music, their constant movement his entertainment. The line between reality and delusion blurred. He saw things, heard things, things that couldn't possibly be real, or were they? The rats spoke to him. They told him secrets, showed him hidden pathways. They were his guides, his protectors. He was no longer afraid. He was one of them. He embraced the madness. It was his only escape. The world outside ceased to exist. It was a distant dream, a faded memory. He was content in his delusion, surrounded by his loyal subjects. He was the king in his castle, the master of his domain, and nothing else mattered. One day, a new sound, a key rattling in the lock. The heavy steel door swung open. Light flooded into his cell. He cowered, blinded by the sudden brightness. He hadn't seen sunlight in what felt like an eternity. The orderlies entered, their faces obscured by surgical masks. They were here to take him away. He didn't want to go. He belonged here with his rats. They understood him, accepted him. He fought, kicked and scratched like a feral animal, but it was no use. They were too strong. They sedated him, strapped him down. He could hear the rats squealing, sensing his distress. He tried to call out to them, to reassure them, but the words wouldn't come. He woke up in a clean, white room. The smell of disinfectant burned his nostrils. He sat up, his head pounding. He looked around, disoriented, confused. Where was he? What had happened? A doctor entered. His face was kind, his eyes filled with concern. He explained that Henry had been found wandering the streets, delirious and malnourished. He had been brought here for treatment. Henry didn't understand. He had been with his rats in their kingdom. Had it all been a dream, a figment of his shattered mind? He looked down at his hands. They were clean. The grime and dirt of the streets gone, replaced by the sterile scent of soap and antiseptic. He was free. But at what cost? They released him back into the world, a world that seemed alien and strange. He walked the streets, a shadow of his former self. He couldn't escape the memories, the whispers, the beady eyes that followed his every move. He was free, but he was haunted by the ghosts of his past. The rats were gone, but he could still feel their presence. He could hear them scratching, gnawing at the edges of his sanity. He had stared into the abyss, and the abyss had stared back. And in that exchange, something had changed within him. He was no longer the same. He would never be the same. He was crazy Henry, and he always would be.